January 14th, 2016, Wichita County, Kansas. Snow drifted across the empty county roads before sunrise, covering the wheat fields in pale grammy rifroso. Most people stayed indoors that morning, but behind Boone Repair and Welding, another flatbed trailer slowly backed through the frozen mud. Carrying 3 more seized farm machines nobody wanted anymore, Walter Boone stood beside the open shed, wearing an old brown canvas coat that had once belonged to his father. The sleeves were stained black with grease. His gloves were cracked from years of welding and winter work, while younger mechanics sat inside heated dealerships, staring at computer screens. Walter stood silently in the cold, guiding another dead tractor into the growing field behind his shop. More than 40 abandoned machines already sat there beneath snow-covered tarps, combines, balers, old row crop tractors, machines repossessed from bankrupt farms all across western Kansas. One of the finance company workers jumped off the trailer and laughed when he looked around the yard. "Hell," he muttered. "This place looks like a cemetery." The others chuckled. For 12 years, banks and dealerships had dumped repossessed equipment behind Walter's shop because nobody else in Wichita County wanted to store them or cared enough to. Walter never argued about the money. He charged almost nothing, just enough to keep the shop lights burning and diesel inside the old heater near his workbench. But the truth was something nobody in town understood. Walter Boone never looked at those machines like junk. Not once. The trailer driver handed him another clipboard. "Sign here, old man." Walter nodded quietly and wiped grease from his hand before taking the pen. At that exact moment, another truck rolled into the yard, a brand new black Ford King Ranch coated in road salt. Everyone recognized it immediately. Raymond Kessler stepped out wearing polished boots and a heavy coat with Kessler Ag Systems stitched across the chest. He owned the largest dealership in the county. Giant GPS-guided tractors, $1 million combines, machines filled with screens and sensors most farmers barely understood. Raymond loved reminding people that the future belonged to men like him, not men like Walter Boone. He looked across the rows of old machinery and laughed loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "My God," he said, "you're still collecting this garbage." A few workers smirked. "You could have retired 10 years ago if you stopped babysitting scrap metal." Walter stayed silent. Raymond walked toward the dead tractor on the trailer and kicked snow against the tire. "You know what I see back there?" he asked. "The future of every farmer too stubborn to move on." More laughter followed. One worker muttered, "Place ought to have gravestones." Walter finally spoke. His voice stayed calm and slow beneath the winter wind. "Machines ain't the problem," he said quietly. Raymond smirked. "Number." Walter looked across the frozen field. People quit on him too early. For a moment, the yard became silent except for chains rattling in the cold air. But Raymond only laughed again before climbing back into his truck. "Keep telling yourself that, Walter." Then he drove away through the snow, leaving muddy tire tracks across the gravel lot. And what nobody in Wichita County understood yet was that Walter Boone remembered every machine behind that shop, every owner, every farm, every family that disappeared after the bank took the land. Because this story was never really about machinery. It was about promises. Back in the late 1960s, Boone Repair and Welding had been one of the busiest places in western Kansas. Walter's father, Henry Boone, built the garage after returning home from the Korean War. Farmers trusted Henry because he repaired machines honestly and never charged struggling families more than they could afford. Walter grew up listening to engines before he was old enough to drive. When he was 10 years old, he once sat beside his father during a thunderstorm while Henry rebuilt a transmission beneath hanging shop lights. Rain hammered the tin roof so loudly they could barely hear each other. Henry pointed towards the gears spread across the workbench. "You hear that machine talking?" Walter frowned. "Talking?" Henry nodded slowly. "Every machine talks. Most men are too impatient to listen." That sentence stayed with Walter for the rest of his life. By 17, he could rebuild hydraulic pumps, diagnose bad injectors by sound alone, and repair broken transmissions faster than men twice his age. But more importantly, he understood what broken machinery meant to struggling farmers. A dead tractor during planting season could destroy an entire family. Then the drought years of the 1980s arrived, and western Kansas started falling apart. Cornfields dried before harvest. Wheat failed across entire counties. Interest rates climbed so high, banks began swallowing family farms one after another. Walter watched repossession crews haul away tractors, while neighbors stood silently in their own driveways. He still remembered one farmer staring at a chained-down combine, like someone was carrying away part of his life. One night after another foreclosure auction, Henry Boone sat outside the garage beside his son and quietly said something Walter never forgot. "Banks think they're repossessing machines." He stared across the dark fields beyond the highway. "But they're really repossessing years." After Henry died from a stroke inside the workshop office, Walter inherited the old repair shop and almost nothing else. Most men would have sold the building. Walter stayed. And when finance companies needed somewhere to dump abandoned farm equipment, nobody reclaimed anymore. Walter agreed to store it behind the garage. At first it was temporary. Then more trailers arrived. Then more farms disappeared. Years passed. People around town started calling the place the Iron Graveyard. Walter never corrected them, because what nobody knew was that long after midnight, lights still glowed inside Boone Repair. And while the rest of Wichita County believed Walter Boone was storing dead machinery, he had quietly spent 12 years bringing it back to life. For years, nobody paid much attention to the old shop at the edge of Wichita County. People drove past Boone Repair without slowing down. Teenagers joked about the tractor graveyard behind the welding shed. Even local farmers slowly stopped bringing Walter serious repair work once Raymond Kessler opened his giant dealership near Highway 54. Kessler Ag Systems looked more like a modern airport than a farm supplier. Glass walls, bright LED signs, computer diagnostics, rows of enormous tractors lined up beneath giant American flags. Raymond loved standing in front of those machines talking about the future. GPS farming, satellite mapping, automated steering, digital harvest systems. He spoke about farming the same way bankers talked about investments, and people listened because Raymond had money. Meanwhile, Walter still repaired cracked manifolds with old welding rods and kept handwritten notes in grease-stained notebooks older than some mechanics working in town. To most people, Raymond represented progress. Walter represented everything America was trying to leave behind. But stories have a strange way of turning when pride grows too loud. And in March of 2017, something happened that nobody in Wichita County expected. Raymond Kessler died alone inside his office. The secretary found him slumped beside his desk before sunrise, with paperwork scattered across the floor and a cold cup of coffee sitting beside his hand. By noon, the entire county knew. Farmers gathered in diners, whispering over coffee mugs, while snow melted along the roadside outside town. Some genuinely mourned him. Others stayed quiet, because beneath the polished advertisements and expensive machinery, Raymond had built his empire on debt. And deep down, many farmers feared him more than they respected him. 3 days after the funeral, lawyers began sorting through company records. That was when the real problems surfaced. Unpaid loans, missing titles, storage agreements nobody had reviewed in years, and dozens of repossessed machines still legally connected to Kessler Ag Systems. One rainy afternoon, an attorney drove out to Boone Repair carrying 2 cardboard boxes filled with old paperwork. Walter was rebuilding a hydraulic pump when the man entered the garage. "You Walter Boone?" the attorney asked. Walter nodded without looking up. "I'm trying to inventory the seized equipment Kessler stored here." Walter kept working. "Lot of it. That's what worries me." The lawyer removed several faded contracts from the box. "There are machines back there, dating to 2005. Walter finally wiped his hands and looked over. "Sounds about right." The attorney adjusted his glasses nervously. "Well, there's an issue." Outside, wind rattled loose sheet metal against the shed roof. The attorney swallowed once before continuing. "Most of the original owners never reclaimed the equipment." Walter said nothing. "And according to the storage contracts," the attorney continued slowly, "after a certain period of abandonment and unpaid storage fees," he stopped speaking, almost like he couldn't believe what he was about to say next. Walter already understood. The machines no longer belonged to the dealership. Legally, they belonged to him. For several seconds, the garage became completely silent, except for the ticking sound of cooling metal near the workbench heater. The attorney finally looked up. "Did Raymond ever discuss this with you?" Walter stared quietly toward the dark field behind the shop. Number. But something in his face suggested he had always known this day might come. By the next morning, the entire county was talking about Walter Boone. People who had ignored the old mechanic for years suddenly started driving past the shop again. Only now they slowed down. Farmers climbed out of pickups and stared through the fencing behind the garage. Reporters from Dodge City arrived carrying cameras. Even former Kessler employees showed up out of curiosity. Nobody expected much. Maybe a few rusted tractors worth scrap value. But then Walter opened the first machine shed, and the crowd went silent, because the equipment inside didn't look abandoned anymore. The paint had been polished. The tires were inflated. Engines sat covered beneath clean tarps. Battery cables looked new. One reporter walked slowly toward a 1981 Titan Combine and ran his hand across the body panel. "There's no rust." Another farmer lifted the hood of an old tractor and stared in disbelief. "This engine's rebuilt." People moved deeper into the yard. Machine after machine. Restored, maintained, protected from weather, as if someone had spent years preparing them for something. And in truth, someone had. What happened next became one of those stories people repeated across Kansas for years afterward. A former mechanic from Kessler Ag Systems suddenly stopped beside a faded red combine near the rear fence. Then he slowly climbed onto the ladder beside the cab. "No way," he whispered. The crowd looked toward him. He opened the engine compartment and stared silently for several seconds. Finally, he looked down at Walter. "You know what this is?" Walter answered calmly. "A combine." A few people laughed softly, but the mechanic shook his head. "This isn't a regular production model." He pointed toward the reinforced transmission housing beneath the engine. This was a prototype test unit Deere built before federal torque restrictions changed in the early 80s. Now the crowd became quiet again. They overbuilt these machines. The mechanic continued. "Too powerful, too durable. Most were dismantled years ago." Walter said nothing. The mechanic stared at him. "You knew exactly what this was." Walter nodded once. Of course he knew. And suddenly people began realizing something much bigger. Walter Boone had not been hoarding junk. He had quietly spent 12 years preserving an entire generation of machinery. Modern corporations no longer wanted farmers to own. Machines simple enough to repair, strong enough to survive decades. Machines built before software replaced steel. But there was another secret buried even deeper beneath the dust and engine grease. Every machine behind that shop reminded Walter of somebody. The blue tractor near the grain bins belonged to a widower named Earl Jensen, who lost his farm after hospital bills destroyed his savings. The case combine beside the rear fence came from the Ortega family after 3 failed harvest seasons. Walter remembered the day each machine arrived. He remembered the silence on those trailers, the humiliation in the owners' faces. Some cried quietly. Some refused to watch while chains pulled equipment away from barns their grandfathers built. And after the trailers left, most of those families disappeared from the county forever. That was the real reason Walter repaired the machines at night. Not for profit, not for collecting, certainly not for glory. He rebuilt them because somebody needed to remember those people existed. And what Walter found hidden inside several machines over the years only deepened that feeling. Family photographs behind seats. Children's drawings folded inside maintenance manuals. One farmer had hidden unpaid church donation envelopes beneath a floor mat. Another combine still carried dry dirt from land the bank eventually sold to developers. Walter kept every one of those things in old wooden drawers inside the office. Because this story was never really about machinery. It was about dignity. And dignity was something Walter Boone refused to let rot away in a scrapyard. But by the summer of 2017, forces much larger than Wichita County had started paying attention to the old mechanic, and what happened next would place Walter Boone directly against the same system that once destroyed his family. A corporation from Texas called Midland Agricultural Holdings arrived in Wichita County 2 months later. 3 black SUVs pulled into Boone Repair one humid afternoon, while farmers stood outside the diner across the road watching. The company representatives wore pressed shirts and expensive watches. They walked through the machine yard, carrying tablets and calculators while speaking quietly among themselves. One man finally approached Walter beside the shed. "You understand what this collection is worth?" Walter kept tightening bolts on an engine mount. "Worth enough." The businessman smiled. "We're prepared to offer $2.3 million for everything." Even the workers nearby stopped moving. $2.3 million. For a moment, nobody spoke. The businessman extended a hand. "You'd never have to work another day in your life." Walter looked across the field of restored machinery. Rows of tractors glowing beneath the Kansas sunset. Machines everyone once called worthless. Then he looked back at the man. "They ain't for sale." The representative blinked. "I'm sorry." Walter returned to his tools. "I said they ain't for sale." The businessmen exchanged confused looks. One of them laughed softly, as if Walter didn't understand the number being offered. But Walter understood perfectly. And deep down, that was exactly what frightened them. By the spring of 2018, western Kansas was drowning. 3 straight weeks of violent rain turned thousands of acres into deep mud fields. Creeks overflowed. Dirt roads collapsed beneath grain trucks. Entire sections of farmland became impossible to cross without sinking axle deep into wet ground. And then the modern machines started failing. At first, it was only a few tractors. Electronic steering systems shorted from moisture. GPS receivers lost calibration beneath constant storms. Sensor failures spread across the county faster than people expected. Some combines shut themselves down completely after water seeped into their control modules. Farmers who still owed hundreds of thousands of dollars on brand new equipment suddenly found themselves stranded in fields they couldn't plant. Every day mattered. Corn season was slipping away. And the worst part was this. Kessler Ag Systems no longer had the parts inventory or technicians to handle the breakdowns after Raymond's death. Machines worth $500,000 sat dead in the mud, while desperate farmers waited for software resets and replacement modules that never arrived. The pressure across Wichita County became unbearable. At the diner in town, men stopped arguing about sports and politics. Now they only talked about weather forecasts and planting windows. How many days left? Maybe 6, maybe less. One farmer quietly admitted he might lose his land if he missed another season. Nobody laughed anymore. Then one cold April morning, something happened. People would talk about for years. Before sunrise, the lights inside Boone Repair turned on. By 7 o'clock, engines began rumbling behind the old machine sheds. Deep mechanical sounds rolled across the fields like distant thunder. Farmers standing outside the diner slowly turned toward the highway. Then they saw them, one by one. Old machines emerged from behind Walter Boone's shop. A red case tractor, a faded Titan combine, an old 4-wheel drive Steiger with fresh tires, and rebuilt hydraulics. No digital screens, no satellite guidance, no touch panels, just steel, diesel, gears, and engines rebuilt by hand. People stepped outside into the cold wind to watch. The machines rolled slowly down the road beneath gray Kansas skies, while exhaust drifted into the morning air. And behind the wheel of the first tractor sat Walter Boone, wearing the same brown coat his father once wore decades earlier. Nobody spoke as the convoy passed through town, not because they didn't have words, because suddenly nobody felt sure about anything anymore. By afternoon, Walter's restored machines were working fields. Modern equipment couldn't even cross. The old prototype Titan combine pulled through knee-deep mud without hesitation, while newer harvesters remained buried to their axles. A crowd gathered near one flooded soybean field, where 2 massive modern tractors had already failed. Walter climbed quietly into an old Steiger that most people once called scrap metal. Then he drove straight through mud that had stopped machines worth nearly 20 times as much. The crowd went silent. One farmer removed his hat slowly. Another man whispered, "Good Lord." But the moment nobody forgot came later that evening. A young rancher named Caleb Morton stood beside his flooded field with tears in his eyes. His father had died the previous winter, leaving him buried beneath debt and equipment payments. Caleb approached Walter carefully. "I can't afford to rent one of those," he admitted quietly. Walter looked across the soaked field. "How many acres left?" Almost 300. Walter reached into his coat pocket and handed him a set of keys. "Bring it back with fuel in the tank." Caleb stared at him in disbelief. "That's it." Walter nodded once. For several seconds, the young farmer couldn't speak, because in that moment, Walter Boone did something the banks, corporations, and dealerships had forgotten how to do years ago. He trusted somebody, and once word spread that Walter was loaning machines to struggling farmers, everything changed. Men who once laughed at the iron graveyard now lined up outside Boone Repair before sunrise. Some arrived embarrassed. Some avoided eye contact completely. A few were the same people who once mocked Walter beside Raymond Kessler in the snow. Walter never mentioned it, not once. He simply listened to what fields needed planting and handed over keys. Within days, nearly every restored machine behind the shop was working somewhere across Wichita County, and something strange began happening across town. People stopped talking about horsepower and technology. Now they talked about reliability, durability, simplicity. The old values farmers once respected before corporations convinced them newer always meant better. But perhaps the most important moment came 3 weeks later. Raymond Kessler's son drove out to Boone Repair alone. His name was Daniel. Unlike his father, Daniel looked uncomfortable, wearing expensive clothes. He stepped into the garage quietly while Walter worked beneath the hood of an old combine. For several seconds, he simply stood there, listening to tools clink against metal. Then he finally spoke. "I came to apologize." Walter kept working. Daniel swallowed hard. "My father." He paused, looking down at the concrete floor. He thought progress meant replacing everything old. Walter slid out from beneath the engine slowly and wiped his hands with a rag. He wasn't completely wrong. Daniel looked surprised. Walter leaned against the combine tire, but he forgot something important. "What's that?" Walter glanced toward the open garage door, where the evening sun stretched across the machine yard outside. Machines are supposed to help people survive. Silence filled the garage. Then Daniel quietly asked the question nobody else had dared ask before. "Why'd you fix all of them?" Walter looked out toward the rows of tractors glowing orange beneath the sunset, and for the first time in years, there was sadness in his eyes, because somebody should have. That answer stayed with Daniel for the rest of his life. Years later, people still talked about the spring when Walter Boone's graveyard machines saved Wichita County, not because of the money involved, not because of the headlines, but because the story reminded people of something America had nearly forgotten. Old does not mean useless. Quiet does not mean weak. And a man wearing worn-out gloves in a small repair shop may understand more about life than men sitting inside glass offices worth millions of dollars. Walter Boone never became rich. He never sold the collection. Instead, he turned the old repair yard into a cooperative equipment program for struggling farmers across western Kansas. Machines were rented cheap, sometimes free, especially for widows, young farmers, and families close to losing their land. People offered to name roads after him. Walter refused. Reporters tried turning him into a celebrity. He avoided interviews whenever possible. Most evenings, he still closed the garage himself and sat outside beneath the Kansas sunset, listening to engines cool in the dark, just like his father once did. And visitors who stopped by Boone Repair years later often noticed something hanging above Walter's old workbench. A wooden sign stained by age and oil smoke. 7 simple words Henry Boone once told his son during a thunderstorm long ago. "Every machine talks, most men never listen." And maybe that was the real lesson hidden inside the old iron graveyard at the edge of Wichita County. The world changes, technology changes, money changes, but pride still blinds people the same way it always has. Too many men laugh at things they do not understand. Too many people throw away what still has value simply because it looks old. And sometimes the strongest thing in the world is not the newest machine in the field. Sometimes it is the quiet old man everyone underestimated, patiently rebuilding forgotten things, while the rest of the world was too busy chasing something shiny and new.